May 25, 1945. A formation of Japanese P-1Y Francis bombers roars toward an American task force near Okinawa. The ocean below boils with anti-aircraft bursts, black blossoms of fire chasing silver streaks across the sky. Inside one of those bombers sits Lieutenant Junior Grade Kaoru Hasegawa, 21 years old, gripping the control stick until his knuckles turn white. He's the squadron leader from Nagoya, a boy barely out of flight school, leading 3 aircraft loaded with 1,760-pound bombs. Below him lies a moving city of steel cruisers, destroyers, battleships, the pride of the United States Navy. One of them, the USS San Francisco, is his assigned target. If he succeeds, he will die. If he fails, he will still die, but in shame. Hasegawa's heart hammers against his ribs as tracer fire laces the sky. He whispers the words that have haunted him through months of training. I will go to the goal this time. He's already failed twice. Both times, mechanical issues forced him back to base, alive. And in the barracks, he saw what became of pilots who returned, their eyes downcast, their reputations in ruins. In Imperial Japan, there was no forgiveness for survival. He's been told the Americans are monsters, that they torture captured pilots, that they keep skulls as trophies. He's seen the propaganda posters, heard the officers whisper the horror stories. So Hasegawa has made peace with only one ending death. He will strike the enemy ship or be shot down trying. But as his bomber dives, and the West Virginia's guns find their range, another possibility appears, one he never imagined. Because on this morning in the Pacific, one man's act of mercy will rewrite the fate of this young pilot and challenge everything he has ever believed about war, honor, and humanity. The first shells burst so close that the cockpit windows seemed to crackle. Hasegawa felt the Francis shudder violently as splinters of flak tore through the fuselage. Below, the Pacific shimmered under morning light, a beautiful, indifferent stage for death. He could see the American formation clearly now, gray hulls cutting through blue water, their decks alive with gunfire. Tracer rounds streaked upward like fiery needles. The sky was chaos. Smoke, metal, and screaming engines. A nearby bomber exploded mid-air, fragments tumbling past his canopy. The explosion lit the horizon like a sunrise. And yet, somehow, he pressed forward, keeping his eyes locked on the cruiser San Francisco. If he could reach her deck, if he could make contact, his life would mean something. Then the West Virginia's batteries opened up. A wave of concussive force slammed the Francis sideways. His co-pilot shouted something, a warning, a prayer, but the sound was swallowed by engine roar. Another hit. Smoke poured from the right wing. A third explosion. And suddenly the plane was no longer flying, it was falling. Down below, aboard the destroyer USS Callaghan, 20-year-old Boilermaker Robert Thatch was at his battle station when the order came. Enemy bomber, 2 o'clock. Range decreasing. The gunners pivoted their barrels and let loose. Within seconds, a curtain of fire wrapped the sky. Commander Charles M. Berthoff, standing on the bridge, watched the Japanese plane disintegrate piece by piece. He'd seen dozens like it that week. Kamikazes, relentless, fearless, and tragically young. His men didn't cheer when the target fell. They simply adjusted their aim to the next incoming dot on the horizon. But then, through his binoculars, Berthoff saw something unusual. One small figure, drifting on the waves. A man, a survivor. The Francis had slammed into the sea, just off Callaghan's starboard bow. Amid the floating wreckage, a single body bobbed in the oily water, face down, unmoving, probably dead, someone muttered, but Berthoff hesitated. Even as the next attack wave approached, he weighed the choice no captain wanted. Risk the ship 320 lives to save one enemy pilot who had just tried to destroy them. Regulations were clear. You do not break formation in battle. The destroyer's guns were still hot. Sirens still howled. And yet, in that instant, Berthoff gave the order that defied logic and doctrine alike. Launch rescue boats. Down on deck, sailors blinked in disbelief. Gunner's mate Leo Jarbo, just 18, watched as a small craft was lowered into the surf. Enemy planes were still circling, but the rescue crew pushed off anyway, paddling toward the drifting pilot. The sea smelled of fuel and fire. When they reached the wreckage, the man in the water was barely alive. They hooked an arm under his shoulder and hauled him into the boat. His flight suit was shredded, his skin burned, his breathing shallow. They could see the Japanese insignia on his sleeve, a kamikaze, the very kind that had sent American ships and friends to the bottom all week. Still, the sailors rowed back toward the ship he had meant to destroy. They hoisted him onto the deck and laid him beside a coil of rope, one more silent casualty of a brutal day. Thatch would later recall, within less than 30 seconds, it was all over. We had him in the water. To him, it was routine. To Hasegawa, unconscious and bleeding, it was the first act of mercy he would ever receive from the enemy. The first thing Hasegawa felt was pain, then the smell of oil. When his eyes opened, the world above him was steel gray, the deck of a U.S. destroyer alive with motion and noise. He was lying where they dropped him, half drowned, half conscious, certain that the next sound he'd hear would be the click of a rifle bolt. For a long moment, he stayed still, pretending to be dead. Boots thundered around him. Sailors shouted orders. The ship's guns still barked at the sky. Every instinct told him this was the end. He had tried to kill these men, tried to ram his bomb into their ship, and now he was on their deck. No one in Japan had ever described what happened next, because no one believed it could. A shadow fell across his face. A hand reached down. Not a weapon, a tin cup. Water sloshed inside. The sailor holding it couldn't have been older than Hasegawa himself, maybe 19 or 20. He said something in English Hasegawa didn't understand, then gestured drink. The pilot stared at the cup as if it were a trap. Why would they waste fresh water on a condemned enemy? He hesitated, then drank. The water burned his throat, salty, metallic, alive. When he looked up again, the sailor was gone already, back at his gun station. Hasegawa tried to sit, but pain pinned him down. His body was shredded with burns and cuts, his flight suit stiff with salt. Around him, Americans ran efficient routines, shouting bearing numbers, reloading shells, dousing small fires on deck. No one jeered, no one struck him. They simply worked, professionals doing their job in the middle of chaos. When the last enemy plane vanished into cloud, calm settled over the destroyer. A corpsman knelt beside him, checked his pulse, and barked an order for bandages. They cleaned his wounds roughly, but without cruelty, their hands practiced, quick. To them, it was just another casualty. Friend or foe, it didn't matter. For Hasegawa, it was incomprehensible. He had been taught Americans would torture him, carve him up for trophies. Instead, they patched his wounds. They didn't even tie his hands. As night fell, the Callaghan's decks cooled under Pacific wind. Hasegawa lay beneath a canvas tarp, staring at the unfamiliar stars, and realized his terror had given way to something stranger. Confusion. If the Americans were capable of mercy, what else had been a lie? Somewhere deep inside, a lifetime of certainty began to crack. The destroyer's engines throbbed through the night as the Callaghan escorted the task force towards safety. Somewhere deep inside her hull, a wounded enemy lay in borrowed blankets, drifting between consciousness and fever dreams. When Hasegawa finally woke again, he was in a different ship altogether, the battleship USS New Mexico. A nurse with an American flag patch was checking his bandages. For a few long seconds, he didn't breathe. Then he remembered where he was. He was alive. And that, in his world, was the worst possible outcome. In Imperial Japan, a kamikaze who returned was not a survivor. He was a disgrace. To live after failing the mission was to stain your family name, to betray your emperor. From the moment he realized the Americans would not kill him, Hasegawa's mind became a battlefield more violent than any sky over the Pacific. He had been trained to believe capture was impossible, unthinkable. Now it was his reality. He refused food. He turned his face to the bulkhead when the sailors tried to speak to him. He thought of his parents in Nagoya, of the officers who had bowed to him before takeoff. They would never know that he had been spared. In their eyes, his soul was already gone. So, one night, when the ward was quiet and the watchman's footsteps faded, Hasegawa made his decision. He would finish the mission himself. If he could not strike the enemy, he could at least die as a soldier. The attempt was desperate and clumsy, his body too weak, his wounds too severe, but he tried anyway. When the guard found him, blood pooled beneath the cot. The alarm sounded. Doctors rushed in. Hands pressed against his chest. Voices shouted for bandages, morphine. And once again, the Americans saved him. The irony was unbearable. Even when he tried to die, they refused to let him. He expected punishment, maybe anger. Instead, he heard scolding not for him, but for the guard who had failed to keep the patient safe. That night, lying under the dim lights of the New Mexico's infirmary, Hasegawa stared at the ceiling and felt something inside him shift. He had wanted death. They had given him life twice, and they treated that life as if it mattered. He didn't understand it, but he could no longer deny it. By the time the battleship reached Guam, his fever had broken and the pain had dulled. The Americans transferred him to a field hospital, tagging him as enemy prisoner, non-combatant, a category that wasn't supposed to exist for men like him. As the ship's doctor signed the papers, he paused and looked at the young Japanese pilot before him. "Son," he said quietly, "war's over for you now." Hasegawa didn't know the words, but he understood the tone, gentle, final. The war inside his mind had just begun. The journey to Guam was long and hot, salt air mixed with antiseptic in the wardroom where Hasegawa was kept under watch. He didn't speak, he barely moved. In his mind, capture was the same as death, only slower, more shameful. But as the days passed, the things he saw refused to fit the world he'd been taught to believe in. Every morning, the corpsman checked his temperature. Every evening, someone left a tray of food beside his bed. It wasn't much bread, beans, weak coffee, but it was food. No one kicked him. No one spat on him. No one paraded him before the crew. When the New Mexico reached Guam, he was handed over to medical personnel from the U.S. Army. The doctors treated him exactly as they treated their own wounded. Bandages changed, morphine measured, charts written with careful handwriting. The officer who signed the papers didn't even look angry, just tired, as if another broken human body, enemy or ally, was simply part of the day's work. At the American prisoner compound in Hawaii, the shocks continued. The camp had barracks, roofs, mattresses. The prisoners were issued clothes, soap, even cigarettes. They worked in the mornings, exercised in the afternoons, received medical inspections. A Red Cross truck came once a week. The guards saluted their officers. The meals were rationed but fair. Rules existed and were followed. It wasn't paradise. It was order. It was civilization. Back home, he had seen American propaganda films where Japanese prisoners were mutilated, burned alive, fed to dogs. Here, the guards played baseball. When one of them lost a glove, he simply asked a prisoner if he'd seen it. The prisoner pointed. The guard thanked him. The dissonance tore through Hasegawa's thoughts. If Americans were capable of restraint, if they obeyed rules even when no one forced them to, what did that say about everything he'd been told? During those months, he heard whispers from other prisoners, pilots, sailors, a few soldiers taken on Saipan or Okinawa. Each had arrived expecting torture. None had found it. They compared rumors against reality, and the scales no longer balanced. Meanwhile, reports filtered into camp. The Allied advance across the Pacific. Japan's cities burning. The Emperor's radio speeches invoking sacrifice. But among the prisoners, a different kind of war was ending. The war between belief and experience. Hasegawa began to watch the Americans closely. He saw how they treated each other, how senior officers addressed enlisted men by name, not by number, how medics spoke to patients with gentleness, even when exhaustion lined their faces. He noticed that they joked, even with prisoners, sometimes offering half a smile before walking away. Humanity expressed in small, ordinary acts. For a man raised in a system where obedience eclipsed individuality, it was astonishing. The Americans followed orders, but they also followed conscience. And slowly, painfully, Hasegawa began to understand that the war he had fought was not only between nations, it was between ideas, submission and self, vengeance and mercy, despair and dignity. Months passed, his wounds healed. The guards began to trust him enough to let him help in the infirmary. He folded bandages, cleaned floors, carried trays. It wasn't atonement, but it was purpose. Each day, he worked beside the same medics who had once fought, his countrymen, and each day, something inside him eased. By summer of 1945, the war's outcome was clear. The Americans treated their prisoners better than his own officers had treated him. The contradiction was complete. When Emperor Hirohito announced surrender on August 15th, Hasegawa sat in stunned silence. He didn't cry. He didn't cheer. He just stared at the horizon and whispered, "So it's over." But for him, something far deeper had just begun the long reckoning with truth. When the guards told him he was going home, Hasegawa didn't believe them. After years of war and months in a cage of conscience, the idea of home felt foreign, almost imaginary. But in early 1946, a transport ship carried him across the Pacific. He disembarked onto a coastline that no longer resembled the country he had sworn to die for. Japan was rubble. Nagoya, his hometown, was half ash. The streets smelled of dust and hunger. He walked among ruins and ghosts, nameless crowds searching for food, for work, for meaning. Everyone had lost something. For Hasegawa, the loss was deeper. The death of everything he had once believed sacred. He tried to build a life anyway. He enrolled at Kyoto University, studied engineering, married, and slowly entered Japan's post-war boom. The years softened his face, but not the question that had haunted him since that morning in May 1945. Who were the men who pulled me from the sea? Decades passed. He built a business, Rango Company Limited, a packaging manufacturer that would eventually employ thousands. To his colleagues, he was a disciplined, modest executive. Only a few knew he had once been a kamikaze. But every year, as May approached, he grew quiet. He would close his office door and look out toward the Pacific, remembering the roar of the engines, the wall of fire, the hand offering water. In the early 1990s, now a wealthy man with the resources to finally chase his ghosts, Hasegawa began to investigate. He wrote letters to naval archives, historians, veterans groups, anyone who might help him trace the battle off Okinawa. For a year, he sifted through combat reports, ship logs, casualty lists. Then one evening, a reply arrived. It named the ship that had downed him, the destroyer that had risked its life to save him. USS Callaghan, DD 792. He felt a rush of gratitude and then a new wound. Because the letter contained one more line. The Callaghan was sunk on July 29, 1945, by a kamikaze attack off Okinawa. The ship that had spared him had been destroyed by another pilot who had not been spared. 47 Americans lost. The irony was merciless. Hasegawa read the sentence again and again. The very code that had once ruled his life had finally claimed the men who had shown him mercy. For days he said nothing to anyone. He carried that revelation like a stone in his chest. But then something shifted. He realized that tragedy didn't erase grace. If anything, it magnified it. Those sailors had lived and died by a code entirely opposite to his own, a code that valued life, even in enemies, and he decided their memory deserved to be honored. On the 50th anniversary of the Callaghan's sinking, in July 1995, Hasegawa reached out to the U.S. Navy Memorial in Washington, D.C. He asked to attend the wreath-laying ceremony. When permission was granted, he boarded a flight across the ocean he once tried to weaponize. He came not as an enemy, not as a survivor, but as a man seeking to say thank you. The ballroom in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, was filled with gray hair, medals, and the low hum of memory. About 100 men, former crew of the USS Callaghan, sat at round tables, trading stories of the war, laughing the way only survivors can. Then, as the doors opened, the room fell silent. A slight Japanese man in a dark suit stepped in, carrying a bouquet of white lilies. He bowed once, deeply. No one moved. For a moment, it was as if the Pacific itself had entered that room. The noise of waves, the echo of engines, the half-century of distance collapsing into a single breath. The veterans looked at him, uncertain. Some recognized the name from a newsletter circulated weeks earlier. Kaoru Hasegawa, the former Kamikaze pilot their captain had ordered them to rescue in 1945. He had come all the way from Japan to meet them. Through an interpreter, he began softly, "The enemy yesterday," he said, "can be your friend today." He paused, his voice trembling. At certain times, man has to fight against each other, and nations against nations. But when the war is over, they become friends. The words hung in the air. Then, the applause started hesitant at first, then rising until it filled the room. Men stood. Some wiped their eyes. 18-year-old gunner Leo Jarbo, now a retired plumbing foreman, stepped forward and embraced him. "To come all the way from Japan to do this," Jarbo said thickly, "means a lot." Nearby, Boilermaker Robert Thatch, the same sailor who'd watched Hasegawa's plane fall into the sea, shook his head and smiled. "The war ended 50 years ago," he said quietly. "It's time to put all that behind us. I believe in forgiveness." From that moment, Hasegawa stopped being a stranger. He was family. He attended every reunion after that, flying from Osaka each year to wherever the Callaghan's men gathered. He brought gifts, fine watches, lacquered boxes, delicate origami cranes. He hosted lavish dinners in Washington's best restaurants, always insisting the bills be sent to him. He donated $10,000 to the Navy Memorial Fund in honor of the crew that had saved him. And his gestures went beyond ceremony. He invited Admirals William Crowe, Elmo Zumwalt, to join these gatherings, turning them into festivals of reconciliation. He spoke to young naval cadets about compassion, about how one act of mercy could outlast the war that inspired it. One year, a former Callaghan crewman approached him holding a small cloth bundle. Inside lay a wristwatch rusted, the glass cracked. It was the one Hasegawa had worn when they'd pulled him from the water. The sailor had kept it for 50 years. Hasegawa stared at it for a long time, then pressed it to his heart. The following year, he returned the gesture, presenting that same man with a jeweled Seiko quartz watch, engraved with the words, "To my brothers of the Callaghan, thank you." In 2000, he paid for Jarbo and 2 former officers of the destroyer, Jake Highmark and Buzz Bazzetti, along with their wives, to spend 10 days in Japan. He guided them through Kyoto's temples, introduced them to his family, and treated them to the kind of hospitality once reserved for honored allies. They walked side by side through the Peace Park in Hiroshima, silent beneath the shadow of the A-bomb dome. Enemies no longer just men who had seen too much war and lived long enough to cherish peace. To ensure that peace would outlast them, Hasegawa founded a naval exchange program, funding young American and Japanese students to study each other's countries. He wanted new generations to learn what he had learned too late, that mercy could do what war never could build understanding. Until his death in January 2004, he never missed a reunion. Every year, he crossed the ocean to sit beside the men who had once fired at him and then saved him. He laughed with them, toasted with them, mourned the ones they'd lost. The sailors who had risked their lives to rescue him now called him brother. And for Hasegawa, that word meant everything. When interviewers asked him, near the end of his life, how he managed to live with having survived a kamikaze mission, Kaoru Hasegawa would pause for a long moment before answering. At last, he would say softly, "At that time, I thought it was dishonorable not to have succeeded in attacking the United States ships. But now, I do not think that way. He was not supposed to exist. There are no kamikaze survivors. By definition, the mission ends in death. Yet here he was, a man who had tried to kill his enemies, only to be saved by them, carrying proof that mercy can outlive ideology. The lesson of his life reached far beyond a single rescue in a single war. Captain Berthoff's decision aboard the Callaghan, made in seconds under fire, was not merely compassion. It was conviction. He chose to act on principle even when logic, fear, and rage screamed for vengeance. That decision reflected something deeper than orders or regulations. It reflected identity, the American belief that how you treat even your enemy defines who you are. Across the Pacific, that same principle shaped the post-war world. After the surrender, America could have ruled through punishment. Instead, it chose reconstruction. The Marshall Plan in Europe, the rebuilding of Japan, both were born from the same moral code that guided a destroyer captain off Okinawa. You treat the defeated with dignity, because peace built on humiliation never lasts. And the results spoke for themselves. Within a decade, Germany and Japan, nations once sworn to destroy America, stood beside her as allies, partners, democracies rebuilt from the ashes of total war. Imagine if the opposite had happened. If the camps had been cruel. If the prisoners had been tortured. If America had answered hate with hate. Would those same nations have ever trusted her leadership? Would a man like Hasegawa have returned year after year? Crossing the ocean, not to avenge, but to thank. Mercy, it turned out, was not weakness. It was strategy. It was strength. It was proof that civilization could survive even in the darkest hours of combat. The Callaghan's crew never thought of themselves as philosophers or diplomats. They were sailors, doing their duty. Yet their small act of humanity rippled outward through generations, touching veterans, students, even the grandchildren of men who once faced each other down the barrels of guns. When Hasegawa stood before those aging Americans in Tennessee, he embodied that ripple. He was living evidence that compassion can bridge even the Pacific. He had every reason to hate, and instead, he chose gratitude. He spent his fortune not on memorials of war, but on scholarships of peace. 50 years earlier, he had screamed through tracer fire, certain that death was the only honorable ending. Instead, he found life, and through it, a greater honor. Because in surviving, he learned the truest measure of victory is not destruction, but decency. So when we remember the Callaghan and her crew, we remember more than a battle. We remember the moment a captain refused to let the sea claim one more soul. We remember the choice to save an enemy instead of letting him drown. And we remember that from that single act grew a friendship that outlasted empires. On May 25, 1945, Kaoru Hasegawa expected to vanish in fire and water. He found humanity instead. And that discovery, made in the heart of war, became his life's greatest mission. Because how we treat the defeated, even when the world burns around us, reveals who we truly are.